I'm going to call this February 26th meeting of the Finance Committee to order.
Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me make sure we're live.
Okay,
Ben, are we live?
Yes, we're live.
Thank you.
roll call.
Okay. Counselor Cassett.
Here.
Chair Lindell.
Here.
Counselor Faulkner.
Here.
Counselor Lee Garcia.
Here.
And Counselor Romero Worth is excused.
Excused.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Any changes from staff to the agenda?
No, Madam Chair, no changes from staff.
Move to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Okay, so unless there are additional items pulled that I'm not aware of at this point, the only item that was pulled was J, which we will get to prior to that. Are there any other items that? Okay.
No, Madam
So-
Chair, only J.
So we'll proceed with an audit update.
Madam, we have to approve consent.
Approval of the, I have a motion.
Motion to approve consent
As amended.
as amended.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Motion passes. Now we move on to the audit update.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I am pleased to report to the committee that the audit is moving along. The auditors are currently working on compliance testing, they're pulling samples, and they're performing their substantive procedures, which is where they gather evidence to support their opinion, and everything is on track. And Madam Chair, I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Director. Are there, Counselor Garcia?
Madam Chair. So it's right now, and we're talking about fiscal year 23, correct? And that's in the, pretty much in the hands now of Carr-Riggs Ingram? Or-
Madam Chair and Councillor Garcia, it is. It's kind of a back and forth process. So Carr-Riggs Ingram is conducting their procedures and we're responding to questions. They're giving us lists of samples and we're pulling supporting documentation, giving it to them. Clifton Larson Allen is helping a little bit, but they're primarily focusing on FY24, working on preparing audit work papers and performing reconciliations of FY24, which will position us really well to be ready for audit so that we can submit timely for FY24.
Okay, and we're pretty much on track with the estimated time. I think what was the date? We're kind of trying to hit.
Madam Chair and Councillor Garcia, May 15th, and yes, I feel comfortable with that date.
Thank you. No further questions, Madam Chair.
Okay. So just to be sure, Pilar, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here, Madam Chair.
Okay, because I'm not seeing you on our screen, so there you are. I'm sorry that you're not feeling well. Thank you for making the effort to come to this meeting.
Well, thank you.
Next item is item J. Consideration of a resolution calling on the city manager to designate appropriate entities and departments within the city to ensure safe and accessible use of bicycle and pedestrian facilities by establishing a regular inspection schedule for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure and developing and maintaining a geographic information system inventory for recording the physical condition of bicycle and pedestrians infrastructure, and calling on the mayor to include the ongoing maintenance of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in his proposed annual budget. And do we have a staff member here for this?
Madam
not.
Chair, it doesn't look like we do. Let me work on that. Let me see if Romello
Uh,
is able to join us.
This item was pulled by Counselor Cassett and myself. Counselor Cassett?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I am going to, hopefully some staff will be here soon, but I'll go ahead on with what we can discuss without Romella. There is a lot here that I'm quite excited about and really looking at. I think it does speak to this larger conversation we've been having around the
Point
priorities.
of order, sorry, Counselor Cassidy, I believe we have, one of the sponsors here that could possibly answer some of the questions, so
Well,
just acknowledge that.
Yes, but some of them are very particular to wanting to know with staff, but if,
Thank you.
obviously, if there's anything that sponsor can answer, I'll ask him.
Wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you.
I got lost as to where I was. Oh, and I think there has been a lot of conversation around, how we look at infrastructure, how we understand our needs there. And I think that this really does, starts that really important conversation around looking at the various infrastructure needs that we have. I do have some question. I think a lot of it revolves around the FIR, which is where my primary concerns lie. But also understanding what we already have going on at the city that might actually dovetail quite nicely. So I'll start with some of the technology pieces, and I think Director Oster should be able to provide some information. As I understand it, we have two systems that are coming online that I think would actually work very well with what this is proposing. One is Questica, and the other is, I believe it's the capital asset management arm of Munis. Can you speak to both of those? What essentially they'll be doing and how I mean, and then I can talk about how I think that those actually work really well with this.
Certainly, Madam Chair and Councilor Cassidy, I'd be happy to talk about what we have in the pipeline in terms of IT projects related to managing infrastructure and capital assets. So the first project that you mentioned was Questica, which is a budgeting software that we're planning to implement this summer after we finish with the preparation of the FY25 operating budget. And that software has functionality that allows the tracking of capital infrastructure items. The way that I understand it, it will allow for life cycle planning. So, when we put an asset into service, that's not the end of the story. We also need to maintain it. And at some point, we'll eventually need to replace it. So this Questica software will help us anticipate, when maintenance will need to occur and potential future replacement. So I do think that some of the items identified in the supporting documentation for the FIR could potentially be done through the Questica software. And then with regard to the Munis module, we have been working for quite a while now on getting the capital asset module implemented in Munis. And that will allow us to track our capital assets, to record what's called depreciation, which is the expensing of a capital item over time, additions and deletions, and then eventually remove them once they're finished, if they're disposed of or they're no longer in use by the city. So I think that software may come into play here as well for some of the items that are included as needs that were identified related to bike and pedestrian infrastructure.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I really, I just found out about it actually in our meeting. So when I was reading this, the prioritizing of the maintenance, and understanding how that fits in with all of our other infrastructure needs. I do not believe it has a mapping capability. Is that correct, though?
Madam Chair and Councilor Cassett, To my knowledge, neither of those programs have a GIS mapping component. However, I believe there are other city departments that do use GIS, for example, land use. So I think there's potential to utilize existing software that other departments already have. I also understand that the utilities division uses GIS for some of their asset management, like, particularly things that are underground. We tag them with GIS so that we can, with little tracking devices, so we can make sure that we have the location of
Right.
everything, even after it's buried in the ground.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's something I'd really like to explore, is understanding what the capabilities with our current GIS system, knowing that we have some of these other tools coming on board that are really going to provide that data piece. So potentially not having to purchase a new system if we do already have in the pipeline things that are going to work. So that's something that I am quite interested in exploring. I don't believe, we don't have Ramella here, correct? Still.
Madam Chair and Councillor Cassett, we don't. I've checked with Armenia. I know Regina, Director Wheeler is not available this evening. Let me keep working on Ramella. Maybe she can join us by Zoom if she's not able to be here in person.
Right. I mean, in general, I think that there are some areas here that I'd like to actually hold this and take a look at for the next couple weeks. Understanding how we determine priorities right now. I think that that is a really big policy issue that has come up quite a bit. And I always think about this conversation I had with John Romero, back when he was here in 2020, about the prioritization of roads and how we never got to our residential streets, because with the prioritization matrix, you were always just going to go for the highest volume. So all of our major and minor arterials, and that understanding of how you start to divide those. And I think for bike and pedestrian infrastructure, especially bike trails, and looking at that sidewalk map that we have at MPO that shows all of the gaps in sidewalks. I think as we take a larger view of all of those infrastructure needs, where we are building, where we are repairing, that how we start to chunk those things out is going to be very important. Also in regards to funding, I think Director Oster, this would be for you as well. My understanding for a lot of our infrastructure funding, especially as I look at some of the projects that we have for bike and ped through MPO, it doesn't necessarily, and often frequently other than staff, does not come from the general fund. We are using a number of different federal sources. It looks like some state sources. I know that we have discussed through the MPO our ability to find matching dollars so that we're actually able to pull those monies down. So rather than having to really dedicate a lot of dollars from the general fund, which we would like to utilize for other pieces, that we can pull that money down. I'm seeing CDBG and obviously capital outlay from the state, some HSIP programs, a bunch of acronyms that I do not know what they stand for, but essentially state and federal. And then also bonding. And that is something that we have had a large conversation about. I do not believe that the city has gone for an infrastructure bond since 2017. So can you give us some more information on where we are in terms of being able to bond soon for a lot of these really crucial infrastructure needs that are being discussed here?
Certainly, Madam Chair and Councillor Cassett, I'd be happy to discuss that. And it gives me a good opportunity to clarify when I'm reviewing an FIR and signing off, what am I looking at? So generally what I'm doing is I'm checking to make sure that the numbers listed on the expenditure and revenue schedule have some supporting documentation, and that I understand the basis for those estimates. What I am not doing when I'm signing off is certifying or indicating that budget is available to fund those items. So I just want to make sure that, everyone, we all are on the same page that, while the numbers that are included for expenditures on this FIR do appear to have supporting documentation, which is included with the FIR, there is not currently funding available for these proposed expenditures. So if this resolution passes, we will need to identify funding. The council will need to identify funding. That is one thing that I noted in reviewing the legislation and the FIR. The issue of where the funding will be directed from doesn't appear to be addressed in the FIR or in the resolution. So that's something that, I would advise the committee that needs to be addressed before this legislation moves forward. So in terms of your question about different funding sources, there are a number for things like what this resolution would propose. On the capital side, we have legislative capital appropriations. One example is we have several pending legislative capital appropriations for trails in the Tierra Contenta area. That money will be coming through. Some of it is already available. So that's great. That's very exciting. We also, as you mentioned, have some grant opportunities through things like MPO that may be able to support specific elements of what this proposal seems to be designed to address. The area where the proposal, I would say I have the most concern is in regards to the FTE, the reoccurring costs and the positions that this proposal would create. So if you take a look at the FIR, you can see that for the recurring costs, the proposal requests a budget of $2.2 million a year of recurring. And looking at the supporting documentation for the expenditures, that consists of a number of new positions that would be created. And so that is an area where it's more difficult to fund FTE with grants. Grants are typically for, one time or short term. There is potentially the option of creating what's called a term position, which is funded for the term of the grant. And, then if the grant were to end, that position would end. The city doesn't do very much of that, but it is possible. So I guess I would say my biggest question in particular in regards to these new FTE that would be created is what is the source of this reoccurring funding?
Thank you so much, Dr. Oster. And back to bonding. We didn't talk about GRT bond.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Councilor Cassidy. I apologize. I forgot about that. So another source of funding for some of the items that this resolution contemplates is our GRT, our bonding program. So that would primarily be for things like capital. So things like building a new trail, purchasing a piece of equipment, for example, a snowplow. The equipment itself, the resolution proposes to purchase a plow truck and a dump truck. Those needs could potentially be addressed through bond proceeds. There's also 2 ATVs and a crew pickup. In regards to software implementation and inventory, as we discussed earlier, we do have several software implementations underway that may be able to address some or all of this need. There's potential that we could use bond proceeds for the upfront implementation costs for software. That one, is a little less clear to me. But in terms of the equipment and the more significant construction, the capital infrastructure, for example, building a new trail could be addressed through bonding.
What about trail repair? So not necessarily snow removal, but I know, for example, in my district, I'm really hoping that actually some of this bonding, I have a number of trails that, especially because they are those smaller residential trails, the Arroyo Chamiso Trail seems to get serviced quite a bit. But I have a number of small residential trails that there are large cracks that they need to be restructured, repaved. Is that going to be a potential for something for when we bond?
Counselors, I would say, yes, maybe. I think it depends on the extent of the repairs. So, if we're talking about routine repairs and maintenance, probably we wouldn't be able to use bond proceeds for that. But if we're talking about more extensive, for example, we have to completely redo the surface. We have to, remove the old asphalt and lay down new or put down a whole new layer. There's potential, there for it gets a little bit more tricky when you're, closer to that line of, does this constitute repairs and maintenance, or is it a capital improvement to whatever the asset is? So what I would say, generally speaking, the more extensive and the more expensive repairs that last longer would generally be capital, and they could potentially be funded through bond proceeds. The less significant, the thing that came to mind for me was repainting the lines. If it has a line in the middle, something like that probably would not be something where we could use bond proceeds. And certainly things like snow removal would not be.
Right. What do we typically use for things like repainting the lines or the small crack fills?
Counselors, I think Director Wheeler is really the expert on that, but my understanding is that we're using our operating funding,
Okay.
for that type of repairs and maintenance.
And so when we're about to do, I know we're about to take on a new capital budgeting process. Can you tell me a little bit more about what, do we know what that looks like? I know that we're waiting for Questica a little bit. And so there's some things shifting right now in terms of how we do our capital budget. Can you give us more information on what's coming up?
Certainly, yeah, counselors. So I'm happy to talk about that. We did do a version of this last year. You may remember, as an amendment to the operating budget, we added about $13 million of one-time and capital expenditures. So what we're proposing is to do something similar this year. The amount is still really up in the air. We know that based on our audited financial statements for FY22, we had $62 million available in the general fund. Now that is one-time money. It is not necessarily required to be spent on capital, but it is one time. So I would really recommend that we not spend it on something recurring, like creating FTE that we're going to have to pay for in future years. But we know that we do have that amount available in the general fund. We know that we have reserve requirements. And also, we know that things may come up in the future where we may need to support ongoing operations using the balance available in the general fund. So I definitely would not advise that we draw it down to the minimum requirement for the reserve that the Department of Finance and Administration requires. So I guess there's a potential for somewhere between $30 and $40 million. But again, I think that hasn't been determined yet.
Okay, and will we be using a similar, I know that I think one of the challenges that we're in right now is we're in kind of, this awkward stage where we're trying to figure out our budgeting process and recognizing, we've had this conversation numerous times within the finance committee that right now the council does not feel like we have as much of a voice in shaping the budget. And I really want to thank you all for implementing where we're having our meetings right now. And I know the chair has discussed that once we get the audits in, the way that the finance committee is going to be really monitoring expenditures and how that's aligning with the budget and looking at the actuals every single month, that's really going to allow us to shift. When we are preparing the capital budget, will we be able to do these similar meetings that we've had for the general operating budget so that we do have an opportunity to bring forward things from, BPAC, or I sit on MPO, or other needs that our constituents have really brought forward in addition to what's already on our CIP list?
Madam Chair and Councillor Cassett, so I think that's a good question. We have just concluded meeting with departments and meeting with counselors to get ideas about policy priorities and input about ideas that both counselors and department leadership have on their minds as we begin, really, as we continue with the preparation of the FY25 budget. So I think last year, the list of projects that were proposed as part of that amendment, that was the capital plan that we did during the budget process, the operating budget process, came from directors. They were suggestions, and they were prioritized by directors based on what they saw as the greatest need in their department at that time. So that's how we did it last year. I think, as you mentioned, this is, still under development. So I think we have received a lot of great input. And as I mentioned, we've met with department leadership. We've met with each counselor individually and gotten ideas and suggestions for priorities. And I think, from there we'll, we don't have the specific details of next steps worked out yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I still don't have anyone from Public Works, but that's fine. I'll say my biggest concern is the allocation of reoccurring dollars via resolution, as opposed to through the budget process, which I understand again is a little bit complex because of where we are with figuring out how the budget process. But especially when I'm looking at this year's budget, I have a number of items that I've actually pulled back. There are a number of departments that I would like to see new FTEs created, but given the results of the classification and compensation that are showing that we're paying on average 19% below market on average, that varies, of course, per classification. And I think that what's really important right now is to prioritize that with funding for, or at least for me, that is where I am coming from. So adding new FTEs, and this many FTEs in this specific area is not something that I am comfortable with at this time. I think that it goes without, it doesn't go without saying. We've had a lot of conversations around the importance between multimodal transition. I was the primary sponsor for the multimodal transition plan. I've been sitting on MPO. And I do completely agree with the focus of this, that there has been we need to rebalance the way that we look at, where we're doing streets versus trails versus, again, that map that MPO has of all the sidewalks that are missing in the city is, it's extensive. And really understanding what that full picture looks like. So that is my concern right now with this, that it's not that I think that the suggestions here are really important. I really appreciate BPAC and Councilor Garcia for, coming forward and being able to have these conversations right now, given classification and compensation, given the number of vacancies that we have in the various departments that touch this. And that's why I was hoping to have somebody here that could really talk about the processes, committing reoccurring dollars via this resolution in a vacuum away from the other parts of the budget. I mean, I know I'd like to see 10 positions added in land use. I'm not going to ask for it this year because I really just want to staff up. So that's why I am really interested in holding this, because I think that there's a lot of good here. And I'd like to take some time to chew on it from the perspective of the Finance Committee. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Counselor Faulkner?
Oh, give me 1 second. Yeah, in looking at this, I had some of the same concerns that Counselor Cassett had. Just from my experience in the legislature, it's when we're getting ready to do the budget, I think that's where the discussion should be had, especially because we're so close to the budget negotiations. If this was like further away from them, I might be more likely to support this avenue for getting this funded. But again, I think I would like to see the language just tightened up a little bit. It feels a little broad to me for some of the things that need to get done. But I would like to hear from the sponsor, Madam Chair, if that's something we can do. I'm not quite up on the procedures and policies yet. Can we hear from the sponsor?
We will. I was going around the committee first.
Okay, yeah, so my concerns is just about process. Like, how do we want to? And I don't know how many of these resolutions have happened in the past, but because there's so much need in the city, I always feel like the budget negotiations is where we should talk about big programs and things that are going to have perpetual costs. And so that's the only concern I
Wait a
have.
second. I don't need to have a side conversation. Please proceed.
But that's the only concern I had. I don't want to see this held up indefinitely. I think we could do some kind of amendment or something and get it out of finance, so it can continue on as best as it can. Those are the comments I have.
Thank you. I will not speak at this point because Counselor Garcia needs to speak to his resolution.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Pro Tem. I just want to point out that the way this meeting has been conducted is completely unfair, as sponsors of legislation in the past has been able to address, whether it's through presentation or respond to questions or respond to inaccuracies that were stated. And I haven't had the opportunity, and I just want to point that out for the public.
Noted. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And so a couple things I want to clarify, just because I feel it needs to be addressed for the public. In regards to really butting up against the budget process, this was something that was out of my control. This legislation has been with the City Attorney's Office since last summer. And the City Attorney's Office only allowed me to bring this forth beginning, I want to say, November timeframe. And through that, we were able to introduce it in January. So it was never my intention to bring this so close to the budget process. But I think we're still within sufficient time before the budget is introduced by the mayor that this could be passed and it can be implemented. There was a lot of inaccuracies regarding what this resolution actually does. And it was referenced by my colleagues that this resolution appropriates a certain amount of money. There is a estimate created by Director Wheeler in regards to what she feels would be the appropriate amount of money to actually get some of the actions requested through this resolution done, but the resolution does not state any money. So I want to clarify that for the record. There is no money associated with this resolution. Resolutions in this follows the same process as resolutions in the past, whether it's a parking pilot program or a Tree Smart Santa Fe program. It's directing our city government to begin to ensure that appropriate issues are addressed accordingly. Nowhere in this resolution does it state that staff will be hired. And just for the record, since the public might not have this at their hand, this resolution is recommending to follow some recommendations that BPAC put forth. and I'm going to read them off. And if anywhere in here it states hiring employees for a certain dollar amount, please stop me. 1, establish a regular inspection schedule to assess the condition of the bicycle, city, and pedestrian infrastructure. 2, develop and maintain a geographic information system based on inventory of the physical condition of each element of the city's bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. 3, use GIS-based inventory to prioritize maintenance and repairs and ensure that infrastructure remains safe and functional, including but not limited to the returning of infrastructure to its original condition or better, especially after planned road or infrastructure maintenance impacts bike ped infrastructure, e.g. roads with markings that are damaged when the road is patched or replaced, street sweeping causes unsafe conditions in bike lanes, etc. Criteria for maintenance and repair actions may include, but are not limited to, the condition of the infrastructure gathered from the inventory list described above. B, equitable distribution of city resources to support bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure throughout the city. C, BPAC recommendations, public input, and constituent requests. D, the importance of a piece of infrastructure to the connectivity of a multimodal transportation network. 4, recommend to the mayor that the mayor's proposed annual budget include ongoing maintenance of a bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, including privately developed infrastructure within city limits. 5, designate the appropriate entities and departments within the city government to implement policies and manage a budget to ensure that bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure is developed and maintained to be both transportation and recreation with appropriate engineering, design, and maintenance funding resources. Now, here's where the action is being asked, that the governing body asks the mayor and subsequent mayors to include adequate funding to accomplish the plan in their respective proposed annual operating budgets, beginning in fiscal year 2025. So let me get back to, my hope was that this was going to be introduced last summer. That way we wouldn't have the argument that we're so close to the budget. Well, it's unfortunate, but the budget hasn't been proposed, at least to my knowledge, and we can give this guidance to the mayor. It also asks the city manager to implement the following recommendations. I as well was a primary sponsor of the multimodal transition plan. And so I take this work very, very seriously. And I want to ensure that through the actions that the governing body has, we can direct that certain resources be invested in our infrastructure. I'm glad to hear that we're having the talk about budgeting, looking at bonding, because just last year, that wasn't the case. And so that is great news to me. Let's do both. Why does it have to be one or the other? We can invest in the operating budget. We can invest through bonding. We can invest in capital, because God knows our city needs it. Our streets are crumbling. Our sidewalks are crumbling. Our bike pathways are crumbling. $2 million, if we're arguing that this is a lot of money, it can be 10 times that amount and we won't meet all the need in our city. It's been stated by Director Wheeler that we have over $300 million in needs for capital in our city. Through Director Wheeler's wisdom, she thinks that just looking at the $2 million allocation will begin to at least somewhat tackle some of these needs for our bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. You know, I think there's always going to be, well, we can't do this because of this. This is not a can't. This is a we need to get this done, especially when we talk about ADA. There's laws that we now have to adhere to. Our infrastructure is not meeting those needs. So again, this is a resolution that is directing for us to begin that investment. And at the end of the day, this is a resolution. This is not law. For the public that doesn't understand the difference between a resolution and a bill and an ordinance, Per our code, a resolution is the formal expression of the opinion or will of the governing body adopted by vote. So say we pass this. There's nothing in law that requires the mayor or the city manager to adhere to it. This has been confirmed in the past by our city attorney when we've asked, what is a resolution? This begins for us to have the conversation. And if there are changes that my colleagues think that would make this resolution stronger, I greatly encourage it because, again, this is an investment that is long past due. It's an investment in an infrastructure that many of our residents utilize, whether those are able or disabled. And we need to ensure that we are meeting the needs of everybody in our community. And that's what this resolution accomplishes. So I don't want us to get off track and say, I'm concerned around the money allocated. I just read where the resolution doesn't allocate any money. The FIR outlines what could be the costs associated, but the resolution doesn't say directly we need $2 million. The resolution does not say we need to hire full-time employees. And I'm glad that there's systems that we'll be bringing on board that might be able to help us accomplish this quicker. But for us to hold this back means that we are holding up the investment that is much needed in our community. Whether it is folks cycling to and from work that are commuting to work, or a disabled person that can't access our city facilities because they're not up to code. I just wanted to clear up some of the misconceptions that I heard earlier. This is not asking to hire new people. This is not directing a specific dollar amount. It's a proposed amount that is through the FIR. And as we all know, FIRs aren't the guiding policy within a resolution because that has changed multiple times in the past. And there's nothing we as counselors can do about that. Because ultimately we can have a $2 million mark and that investment can be per the resolution. Designate the appropriate amount that's needed. That's up to the mayor to decide. Those are the powers granted in our city code. And if he feels 2 million is too much, appropriate amount that he feels that is appropriate. So I'm happy to answer or entertain any questions, Madam Chair. I just, again, thank you for the opportunity to clarify some misconceptions that I believe were given earlier.
So what it does say is that the governing body asks the mayor and subsequent mayors to include adequate funding to accomplish the plan. We can play with words on this, that it doesn't, what I heard you say was, this resolution doesn't allocate any money. However, in passing this resolution, in order to implement it, we have a pretty good estimate of the amount of money that it will cost. So it's not just words of, well, we want to pass this resolution. Everybody loves this. It's real money. And we also have a resolution from 2016 that says it was unanimously passed by that governing body that amended the financial policies of the governing body to require that the creation of new or the expansion of existing programs and services identify a funding source or an equivalent offset to provide the funding for such new or expanded program or service. I don't think that we've done that here, or I haven't seen it. Counselor Cassett.
Thank you so much. I just want to point out that holding it for one finance committee meeting, it said starting in FY '25. So even if we hold it for one finance committee meeting, it's not delaying funding. And I really want to make very clear, this is not stating that I don't think that the investments here are important. And I am glad to hear that the intent was not to, allocate dollars through resolution. The use of adequate funding is, I think one of that was something to me that means we know that this is it, here's the adequate funding. I also want to point out that this is just through what we have through the MPO. We are currently, I haven't even added or completed adding up, but over $25 million right now going towards bike and ped projects. So for members of the public, we need to do more. It's not that we're not doing anything right now. We do. I think that that's important. And I do think that continuing to look at the policy of how we prioritize is really crucial here. Because that is a big issue. But I would like to clean up the language so that that was how I was interpreting this based on the direction to include adequate funding. I think that there are other ways that we can word this that really does indicate that this is an important investment, and that as we are considering the various investments that we inevitably need to make in the city, not just when we talk about transit, but, you know, overall, when we're looking at the budget, the various needs and both constituent needs as well as just city functioning needs that we have to balance. And I think that there's a way that we can really word this to make it clear that this is a priority that we need to really be considering as we are allocating those dollars on an annual basis. So I would like to move to hold this resolution at the Finance Committee, and we will and to hear it, bring it back on the March 11th Finance Committee meeting.
Second. Counselor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just maybe this question is for the sponsor, since you're trying to move this forward before more discussion on budget hearings start getting underway. How does this work on timeline for that? If I can ask the sponsor that, please.
Thank you, Councilor Garcia, for the question. So ultimately, that will work with the timeline of this resolution, because this still has to go back before the Mayor's Committee on Disability, because they had some technical difficulties during their February meeting, and they were unfortunately able to hear this because they didn't have the resources in an accessible format. The long story short, we're hearing it in March. So this will be heard on March 13th before the governing body. This has already passed one committee. So I don't know how long we can ultimately hold this up, given that it's passed one committee. I guess that's a question I've got. How long could this be held here, given it's already passed one committee, and we've stated in the past we can't hold things up. But I'm happy to bring it back to this committee for any recommendations on strengthening it. My concern is that if we start to change the resolution in the sense that it messes with the caption, it's going to have to be recaptioned, and it can really then mess up the timeline. So that's something I guess I'm more so concerned around, is if we begin to look at changing it in the sense where it modifies the title, then that will ultimately really mess up the timeline of this resolution. And so I do want to clarify, MPO has, Mr. Eric Gani helped with this resolution. He provided some edits and recommendations. Him and his staff did help and strengthen this. So I want to make sure the public is well aware. This is not something that just kind of quickly floated by. BPAC has been working on this resolution for nearly 2 years. And then we worked in collaboration with the Mayor's Committee on Disability to get their approval before we even introduced this resolution. And as we were working on the final drafting of this resolution, we brought in additional staff such as the MPO and Eric and his team. So this has had many, many, many eyes on this, including Director Wheeler and all of her staff. So again, I'm happy to entertain any issues or any changes that would strengthen this. But we've had resolutions in the past that have somewhat allocated funding, whether it is a parking pilot program or a health and wellness program, or even CHART, right? CHART allocated nearly more than $250,000 for a program. So this is not out of the norm.
Thank you, Councilor Garcia, and I appreciate those words. Just one final question for me, I guess, on this, and when was the most recent final kind of draft, finalized? You said that there was some issues getting to the Disabilities Committee and getting their input, but kind of when was the finalization of this resolution?
So this was final at the beginning of January. Staff was doing some late tweaking, and this was pretty much ready to go at the beginning of January. The technical difficulties with it not being able to be heard before the Mayor's Committee on Disability is because city staff did not upload the documents in an accessible format. It had nothing to do with me as a sponsor or the staff that was helping along with this. There's new staff on the Mayor's Committee on Disability, and they didn't know the process in regards to ensuring that all documents for that committee specifically needed to ensure that everything was in accessible format. And unfortunately, it wasn't. They tried to get through that meeting as good as they could, given the resources they had, but they had to postpone a lot of stuff as well. I mean, there was Councilor Chavez's age-friendly resolution that wasn't able to be heard at that meeting. Those are the technical challenges. It wasn't due to myself. This has been ready to go for a long time, Councilor.
Thank you, Councilor. And that being said, I mean, I'm happy to support giving a little bit extra time for the input from councilors' concerns, and hopefully that they are taken and heard well to formulate a resolution that we can all support. Thank you.
Can I
Counselor-
clarify the rules? Oh, sorry. Okay. To Councilor Garcia's question about how long we can hold per our procedural rules, a committee can only hold for one committee meeting. So we could not hold it past our next committee meeting.
Thank you. Counselor Faulkner?
So my concern also, I agree with Councilor Garcia in that if one of the boards can't get it wasn't accessible. I mean, I'm facing that right now as a counselor. We're trying to figure out how to make my packets more readily accessible. So that if I'm concerned if this has to go back to that committee and it isn't going to be accessible, I think we should do everything we can if we're going to hold it up in this committee. And I personally think it could take some amendments that will make it a cleaner piece of legislation. But I just want to make sure if we do that we support the sponsor and the process so that this can go through the process fast enough and effectively, because I don't think this should miss the budget process. I think this is an important piece of legislation. But I do feel like there's a couple of things, just given my experience with budget legislation. There's some things that need to be tightened up. But I do want to make sure that if we do hold it back, that we give the system all we can to make sure this goes through in a timely manner. And I appreciate Council Garcia's concerns about accessibility. I think this is a real issue, and this may be slightly off topic, but it is important. The other thing is a question for staff. We only have to change the caption if the intent of the legislation is changed. Is that right?
Madam Chair and Councillor Faulkner, I think really we would probably need to get the city attorney to weigh in on that. I think it would really depend on the nature of the amendments, whether or not the caption needed to be updated.
Okay. All right, well, maybe that's a follow-up question I can have with the city attorney. Thank you. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Counselor. So I'll just make a couple of comments. I would like to, even though Counselor Garcia, you said that this does not call for expenditure. I see that it does call for expenditure, and well, the amount is what the best estimate of what the department that would be responsible put forth that it would cost. I don't know how to come up with a better cost than that, but my point being that we have not identified a funding source or identified an offset that committee was willing to do. I don't know that BPAC really knows how we do our budgeting. I think that this coming as a resolution is inappropriate. I think it should have come as a report, and that we should prioritize these issues so that we can step into them. I don't think that they're all going to get done at once. And they do have some year over year expenditures. So those are issues that I have with this. But I think we're going to have another chance to discuss it. We have a motion.
Madam Chair, may I just respond to that, please?
Sure.
So, and I'm happy to lay out a laundry list of resolutions that don't follow that 26 resolution. And I think for this specific resolution to be pointed out when there's been resolutions within the past 6 months, there might be resolutions that are before us that aren't following this. So I hope you treat that, all of this legislation the same, because there's resolutions that I believe you've even sponsored that have not followed this. And I believe this one is unfairly being held to that standard, whereas other ones have not. And if we're going to treat one resolution and make sure everything is, then we need to make sure that this is followed. And that should be part of the FIR review process. Let me ask Director Oster, is that part of the FIR review process?
Madam Chair and councilors, the FIR review process consists of making sure that there is support for the information presented in the FIR. It doesn't include identifying a funding source. The legislation itself is, I believe, where the funding source should be identified. I think any piece of legislation that has an implementation cost associated with it needs to consider where those costs will come from, where the funding for those items will come from.
So if it's not in an FIR, where would it be included?
Madam Chair and Councilor Garcia, I believe that 2016 legislation answers that question. The legislation itself would identify the source of the funds.
So back to my point, there's been legislation that recently has passed this governing body that has not identified sources of alternate funding. And I think, again, this legislation is unfairly being held to a different standard than other pieces of legislation that I would say the majority of this governing body has sponsored, and it's passed this governing body. And I think that's very unfortunate. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I do just want to point out that there is a very stark difference between we absolutely have had resolutions where we have said, we direct the city manager to find the money, I believe. This calls for an annual budgeting, not in the mayor's annual operating budget, not just for this year, not for this fiscal year, but in perpetuity. And so I do think that there is a difference in the language that is being utilized, and maybe that's where the kind of confusion is, and looking at how we have worded it in the past is where I would where I think I'm seeing the difference between what we have passed before versus what we are looking at now. But I do think that, you know, that's something that we do need to talk about. We have not been following this resolution. And I also don't think that it would be a good idea to say in this resolution, we're going to take from this pie. And this comes from the challenge of, we do not have a very good aerial view of our budget right now and of our funds right now. And that is, we're moving in that direction. And so I think that this is a really important ongoing conversation of how we start to have these discussions, and as we start to as a finance committee have and as a governing body, as a city council, really do have that broad overview. But Councilor Garcia, I think that's where I'm getting tripped up in that different language, the difference in the language that I'm seeing in this one as opposed to other legislation that I've seen. Thank you.
Counselor Faulkner, your hand is up.
Sorry, Madam Chair, that's an accident.
That's the best accident I've seen today. Okay, so we have a motion. Could we go ahead? And the motion is to hold this until the next finance meeting on, I believe it's March 11th. Have a roll call, please.
Certainly. Counselor Cassett,
Yes.
Chair Lindell,
Yes.
Counselor Faulkner,
Yes,
Counselor Garcia.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Madam Chair, just may I note that I won't be present for that meeting, just for the public knows, I'll be in Washington DC that week. And so I won't be present, and I don't want folks to think I'm just not showing up for my resolution. It's just, I'll be on work travel.
Thank you.
Being that said, can we try to make sure that we do have some staff members here, please, for questioning for that
Thank
meeting?
you.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the agenda is consideration of resolution committing to being a more age-friendly city and enrolling in the American Association of Retired Persons Age-Friendly States and Communities Network, which, to the extent it is possible, will be a process that incorporates universal design principles. Who'd like to speak to that? Or do we need to have a staff report, or do we have a motion?
I would like to move to approve.
Second?
And then there is also an amendment that will need to be moved, but I do have some questions, but if staff would like to give a brief overview, please feel free.
Please.
Madam Chair, the resolution is to adopt an age-friendly, we recognize an age-friendly, for us to go apply for age-friendly, as an age-friendly city. It's a 5-year process. First portion of the process is an application process to the AARP. Then first year, we'll conduct a survey of the community to get together assess what the needs are in the community. And then from there, a recommendation will be made. Study the
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to thank Counselor Chavez, she's not here, but for putting this forward. And thank you for all your work. I have just a couple questions about how this potentially integrates with some of the work that we're already doing and the conversations that you might be having with our Complete Streets team, with the land use team, I know with building codes. So we'll start there and have those conversations. And obviously now we do have an ADA coordinator. So how are these conversations occurring and how would this play into us being a part of this program?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Counselor Cassett, for the question. So this is the first step in enrolling in this age-friendly network. And so we would conduct the application and then we would start listening sessions with the community and surveys. And it's really the commitment of elected leaders to become a more age-friendly city. Age-friendly means friendly for all ages. And so once we conduct the first phase, which is the listening sessions and gathering data, we would bring that back and this would become more of a comprehensive city type process where we would review and then AARP provides a framework by which we can plan our work within the city. So if it's Complete Streets, community services, our facilities, how do we make them more welcoming? And yes, working with Daniel and Public Works will be a big part of it. So it'll really be comprehensive with working with land use, community development, and all of our departments. So beyond community services and senior services, it'll really incorporate finance and all of our city entities. And of course, you being the elected leaders, making those recommendations for how we move forward after we receive the data, and then how we prioritize our work for the city.
Wonderful, thank you. And this might be more of a comment than a question. I don't know if the AARP haven't looked at the program closely, but we also have digital access, which we actually just had this conversation about concerns around digital access, both with our committees. I know just the website in general, we have some access issues. I'm hoping that this will also address not just physical, but digital access across the board. Would that be accurate?
So thank you, Councilor Cassett and Madam Chair. The framework has the 8 methods of livability. And so, of course, accessing your city services and making sure that we provide accessible digital access, that we also provide good customer service and that things work the way we want them to, that will definitely be a part of that questioning. And so I think, our first phase will be, what do we want to know about how people are accessing services in the city? What barriers are they facing? And then kind of develop those questions with a consultant to help us think about ways that we can be a more friendly in all areas of our city.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll just say I started Googling and looking up the universal design and so I love it. So I dove down the rabbit hole of that last night, lost some sleep, but I do appreciate you guys bringing up another place for me to look. I don't have any further questions or comments, Madam Chair. Can I move the amendment at this time? Okay, so there is an amendment. I will read it into the record. On page 4, line 21, delete the period at the end of the sentence and replace it with colon and. On page 4, line 22, insert the following new paragraphs. Whereas the city has a history of seeking to create an inclusive environment for all individuals, and whereas section 2.002 of the city's charter states that human and civil rights of the residents of Santa Fe are inviolate, inviolate, am I pronouncing that right? Yep. And that the governing body shall preserve, protect, and promote human rights through all of its activities, and that those rights shall not be diminished or otherwise infringed regardless of age. And whereas the city recognizes that compliance with Title II of the Americans with Disability Act, Section 202, addresses some of the accessibility goals of the age-friendly states and communities networks. And there is, if you refresh, you'll see the amendment as well as a red line in the packet, and I move to approve the amendment.
Second. Discussion? We have a roll call on the amendment.
Certainly. Counselor Cassett,
Yes.
Chair Lindell,
Yes.
Counselor Faulkner,
Yes,
Counselor Garcia.
Yes.
Motion passes, and that is the amendment.
Pardon me?
I'm ready for the main motion if everyone else is. I already made it.
second,
Please.
Excellent. Okay, so on the main motion, I had Counselor Cassett with the motion to approve and Counselor Lee Garcia with the
Ah.
second. So for the roll call on that motion, Counselor Cassett,
Yes.
Chair Lindell,
Yes.
Counselor Faulkner,
yes,
Counselor Lee Garcia.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Very much. Thank you for being here. Okay, do we have any matters from staff?
Madam Chair, no, not tonight.
From the committee?
I have a matter.
Please go ahead, Counselor.
I would really appreciate it if we could get some kind of study session or some briefing where we can talk as a collective about the $30 million one-time reserves funds. Like that, I just want to put that out there that I do think I personally would gain a lot from that as a new counselor. And so I think it's a lot of money, and I think it would be beneficial for us to talk as a council about it. So that's the only matter I have.
Okay, thank you. Counselor Garcia?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would second that as well. I think it's something that a few of us would like to see and be well received. Thank you.
Counselor Cassett?
Well, that sounds great to me, but I have no further comments. They stated them wonderfully, so.
I am the fill-in chair and I have no matters. Counselor Romero Worth will resume her duties as chair on March 11th. And with that, we are adjourned.